The air in the Lombok coastal heat felt heavy, but inside the Yamaha garage at Mandalika it was suffocating. For years, the Japanese giant had been a shadow of its former self, clinging to a legacy that was slowly being strangled by European engineering. But today, the silence was about to be broken by a sound that didn't belong here. A sound that many believed Yamaha would never produce. Through the blacked-out glass of a private hangar, a prototype emerged. No sponsor logos, no vibrant colors, just raw, exposed carbon fiber and a low, guttural growl that shook the very foundations of the pit wall. This wasn't the screaming Inline-4 that had carried Valentino Rossi to glory. This was the V4, Yamaha's high-stakes gamble to save its future. Lin Jarvis stood in the shadows, his expression unreadable, but his pulse was undoubtedly racing. He had orchestrated an operation that felt more like a spy thriller than a technical test. Private airports, secret airport transfers in the middle of the night, and a complete media blackout. Yamaha was terrified, not of the bike failing, but of the world seeing it before it was ready to strike. The strategy was simple: gather data, test durability, and slip away into the night. But as the first set of tire warmers came off, the plan began to disintegrate, because in the seat of that blacked-out machine wasn't just any test rider. It was the king of world SBK, Toprak Razgatlioglu. And from the moment he clicked the bike into first gear, everyone inside the garage realized this wasn't going to be a data-gathering mission. It was going to be a war. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand the blue DNA. For decades, Yamaha's philosophy was built on the Inline-4 engine. It was surgical, it was smooth, it was the bike that rewarded finesse. But in the modern era of MotoGP, finesse was getting slaughtered by raw, unapologetic power. The gap between Yamaha and the Ducati Red Armada had become a canyon. On the long straights of Mugello and Sepang, Fabio Quartararo was a sitting duck, watching his rivals disappear in a cloud of aero turbulence. The internal politics at Yamaha had reached a boiling point. Engineers in Iwata were hesitant to abandon their heritage, but management knew the truth: change or die. The transition to a V4 was a nuclear option. It meant throwing away 30 years of chassis data. It meant a total redesign of weight distribution, electronics, and aerodynamics. It was a project shrouded in skepticism. Could Yamaha really build a V4 that didn't destroy the flow their riders relied on, or were they about to build a monster they couldn't control? Mandalika was chosen as the ultimate laboratory for a specific reason. The track is a brutal combination of high-speed sweeps and technical sectors, all baked under a relentless Indonesian sun. If the V4 could survive the thermal stress of Mandalika, it could survive anything. But as the sun climbed higher over the circuit, the technical test was about to be hijacked by two riders with everything to prove. When Toprak Razgatlioglu entered the track, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He is a rider who defies the laws of physics. Known for his stoppy celebrations and a braking style that looks like a controlled crash, Toprak was the ultimate wildcard in Yamaha's V4 project. His first run was supposed to be a shakedown. Instead, it was an assault. From the opening laps, Toprak was pushing the front tire to the absolute limit. His trademark extreme late braking was blending with the V4's new engine braking characteristics in a way that left the technicians speechless. He wasn't just riding the bike, he was interrogating it. Inside the pits, eyes were glued to the telemetry screens. The numbers didn't make sense. Toprak was hitting braking markers that the simulation said were impossible for a prototype in its early stages. Every time he leaned the bike into Mandalika's technical section, he was shaving tenths off his previous laps. There was a sense of disbelief among the Japanese engineers. They had spent months worrying about the bike's stability under extreme deceleration, but Toprak was treating the V4 like a toy. He was sending a message to the entire paddock: the outsider has arrived and he's faster than you think. But there was one man who wasn't about to let a guest star steal his spotlight. Fabio Quartararo had been the lone warrior for Yamaha for too long. He had carried the weight of the factory on his shoulders, suffering through seasons of underperformance with a grim determination. For Fabio, the V4 wasn't just a bike, it was his ultimatum. He had made it clear: if Yamaha couldn't give him a weapon to fight the Ducatis, he would walk away. Seeing Toprak's times on the monitor, something snapped in the former world champion. Fabio didn't just enter the track, he hunted it. His style was the polar opposite of Toprak. Where the Turkish rider was violent and erratic, Fabio was a ghost, smooth, deadly, and perfectly efficient. He focused on the one thing Yamaha had always excelled at: corner speed. But with the V4, he suddenly had the one thing he'd been missing: traction out of the turns. The bike seemed to respond to his natural flow, maintaining stability even when he pinned the throttle in the blistering heat. The data-gathering mission had officially evaporated. This was no longer about engine durability or aero maps. It was a head-to-head rivalry between the two most talented riders in the Yamaha family. They weren't just testing a prototype, they were fighting for the alpha position in the garage. And as they began to trade sectors, the intensity reached a level that Lin Jarvis had never anticipated. The air at the pit wall was electric as the two bikes roared past. Toprak and Fabio were now alternating on the track, reading each other's lines, pushing the V4 into territory it was never meant to reach this early in development. This was an unofficial duel, a secret war played out in front of a handful of stunned mechanics. Inside sources claim that Lin Jarvis was seen standing up from his seat multiple times, his eyes fixed on the telemetry. He was witnessing a nightmare and a dream at the same time. On one hand, the risk of a high-speed incident with their only V4 prototype was astronomical. On the other, he was seeing two riders with completely different styles extract the same elite level of performance from the same machine. The V4 was being forced to operate in near-racing conditions. The heat, the sea breeze, and the aggressive maneuvers were the ultimate stress test. Yet the data showed significant improvements in the very areas that had been Yamaha's Achilles heel for a decade: acceleration out of slow corners and wheel spin control at high temperatures. But as the pace quickened, the mood in the garage began to change. The faces of the engineers, which had been serious all morning, were now masks of tension. They realized that if this performance was real, if it could be reproduced, it would change the championship narrative entirely. But it also surfaced a deeper problem. The rivalry between Toprak and Fabio was no longer just a friendly test. It was a ticking time bomb. Why Mandalika? Why now? The decision to hold this test in Indonesia was a masterstroke of strategy. Most manufacturers favor the familiar asphalt of Mugello or Misano, but Yamaha wanted honest data. They wanted a track that would punish the bike. Mandalika's asphalt is notorious for its rapidly changing grip and high humidity. Several engineers later admitted that the data gathered here was more valuable than anything they had seen in Europe. The V4 wasn't just fast over a single lap. It was showing a level of consistency that had been missing from the Inline-4 for years. The bike felt lively, responding to the coastal winds and the demanding technical sections with a stability that surprised even the most cynical members of the team. It was a sign that Yamaha's Blue Revolution was more than just marketing, it was a mechanical reality. But as the sun began to set over the Indonesian coast, the biggest question remained unanswered. Yamaha had stayed silent through the entire test. No official times, no media releases, no social media posts. It was a strategy of silence that signaled one thing: Yamaha was no longer just experimenting. They were building a weapon, and they weren't ready to show the world how sharp the blade actually was. As the bikes were finally pushed back into the garage, a strange atmosphere settled over the team. The usual post-test chatter was replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. The body language had changed. They were no longer the underdogs looking for answers. They were a factory that had found its direction. Toprak's arrival in Indonesia had been a secret for a reason. Yamaha wanted his fresh perspective, his ability to detect subtle changes that GP-hardened riders might overlook. And his feedback had been staggering. He hadn't just tested the bike, he had reshaped the DNA of the next generation of Yamaha racing. But the real twist lay in the telemetry. While everyone was watching the duel, the engineers had uncovered something that left them stunned. The V4 project was actually ahead of schedule. The improvements in throttle response and chassis balance weren't incremental, they were transformative. However, the silence from Yamaha was calculated. They knew that Ducati, KTM, and Aprilia were watching. They knew that the paddock whispers were already starting to spread. By refusing to publish the times, Yamaha was forcing their rivals to play a guessing game. Was the V4 a failure, or was it the bike that would end the Ducati era? The uncertainty was their greatest advantage. The Mandalika test may not have been recorded on the public timesheets, but the message reached the entire MotoGP paddock within hours. The strategy of silence had failed to contain the truth. Yamaha was back in the game. Toprak Razgatlioglu had proven that he wasn't just a guest. He was a central figure in Yamaha's long-term vision. His presence in Indonesia was a signal that the barrier between World SBK and MotoGP was being torn down in the pursuit of performance. For Fabio Quartararo, the test was a rebirth. For the first time in years, he had a bike that didn't require him to ride at 110% just to stay in the top 10. The V4 offered a future where he could finally fight on equal terms. As the team packed up their gear and headed back to the secret hangars, the seriousness in the garage had given way to an optimistic, albeit cautious energy. They were building something dangerous, something that would change the face of the 2026 season. The V4 project, once plagued by doubts and technical hurdles, now had a clear path forward. And while the rest of the world was still debating Yamaha's decline, the ghost in the garage was already preparing for its next haunting.